Here's a very common problem. You're not a drummer. So how do you write drums? If you want to do demos, if you want to track songs and actually have a finished product that you can show people, but you don't have a drummer at hand and you aren't a drummer, nor do you own a drum kit, it can be hard to put drums to a song. But there's a way of doing it. It's called MIDI, and it's the same way that people use keyboards and get cool sounds. It's the same way that electronic musicians get their sounds, except you're actually using real drum sounds, like from real kits. It sounds awesome. I'm going to show you how to do it, and then you can do full demos without a drummer. There's a few things you need to know first, because obviously I'm assuming that you're not a drummer, so you might not know everything. I'll give you a quick rundown on what each drum is and what each cymbal is, because you'll need to know them for writing, otherwise you're just going to be winging it. First is a kick drum. This is the thing that's played by the drummer's foot. It's kind of the bassy thud of the drum kit. Next, and probably the most important bit, is the snare. It's the kind of crack, it's the kind of thing that in electronic music has the clap along with it. It's the big punchy drum that sounds like this. Next is the toms. It's the do-do-do-do-do-do, you know, them. They exist, different drum kits have different amounts. They sound like this. Okay, on to cymbals. Most drum kits have hi-hats, a crash, a ride that you can play in different positions, like this, or this, or this, and normally another crash that sounds different to the first crash. Some drum kits have chinas, some drum kits have splashes, and that's kind of the makings of a drum kit. I'll teach you how to use them, but first let's start with a simple beat. So the makings of a simple beat starts with a kick and a snare. The cymbals we will come to later. So we're going to make something that looks a little bit like this. If you have your view where you can't see what specific drum it is, there's probably some way of zooming in so that it'll actually say this is the kick, this is the snare. If not, C1 is kick, D1 is snare, E1 is snare rim shot, so it's kind of what a more aggressive player would play. Play them both and you can see kind of what it is that you would actually want it to sound like. So this that you're seeing is a standard kick snare pattern. Kick on beat 1 and beat 3, snare on beat 2 and beat 4. It sounds something like this. Yes, that's pretty boring, but we're going to make it more interesting. The first way that we make it more interesting is with a cymbal. We're going to start with hi-hats. The most simple way to put a hi-hat over that, we're going to be using a closed hi-hat by the way, is to just do it when you do the kick, you hit the hi-hat. When you do the snare, you hit the hi-hat. Sounds like this. Still sounds pretty boring, so let's make it more interesting. This is what a drummer would more likely do. Double it up. So it's kick and hi-hat, then and just on the hi-hat, then snare with the hi-hat, and then hi-hat. So you're doing double the amount of hi-hats to any kick or snare. Looks like this, sounds like this. If you wanted, a lot of indie bands do this. I mean, this shows up in a lot of genres, but it's so very popular inside of indie. Go double again. So you have kick, hi-hat, 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 snare with a hi-hat, 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 hi-hat. There's like 4 per individual hit. Looks like this and sounds like this. Okay, there's one more thing that drum beats have if you're inside of pop, rock, metal, indie, and it's accents. So when you're starting a bar of music, generally the drummer will hit a crash cymbal or do something that kind of is like, bang, here we are in the beginning of the bar. I don't know why, it just works. It's in all music that you're aware of. It sounds like this. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna do kick, and on that very first kick, we're gonna hit both crashes, then move to the hi-hat, and then we'll not go back to the crash again until, in theory, it repeats. Sounds like this. Okay, let's get a little bit more interesting. So we've done loads with the hi-hat. Let's basically do the exact same thing with a ride cymbal. So the ride cymbal, in terms of use, is something that's probably more used in a chorus than it is in any other section. It kind of fills out the space a little bit more. You'll know the sound. So here's the exact same example, just with the ride cymbal instead. If you're interested, that was also the ride edge. So it's like if you were hitting the edge of the ride cymbal, because with the ride, generally when you're doing it with MIDI, you have a few different options for where they hit. Like you've got the bell sound, or you can actually do the normal ride sound. This one has an extra one where it's bell out, which I think is even further out of the cymbal, which is a bigger, washier sound. There's loads of options. So just imagine what you would normally hear for that section, or just play around with it. Okay, now we're getting to the interesting stuff, which is fills. So it's the cool stuff that leads you into a section. So we said that when a section starts, you have the accent. Before a section starts, you will have a fill. Some instruments will sometimes do fills, like you'll sometimes have a bass fill going into a section, but the most common instrument to play fills is a drum. Here is the most generic drum fill in the world, but it gives you the example.
Are you gonna put the Phil Collins on?
No, it's do do get do 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 get do 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 do. Okay, that was generic and boring. So let's spice it up. You have pretty much free reign here to do whatever you want because you don't have to physically play it, provided that you're kind of staying to the laws of physics in terms of speed. You can do whatever you want here. So I've done a little something interesting here. You can do whatever you want. Any fill that's ever existed can be composed in MIDI. So, like, literally, the world is your oyster. Go wild. Okay, so we've made the fill interesting, but the beat itself before it is still not very interesting. It's just kick, snare, kick, snare. So let's add some extra things in. The easiest thing to add in extra and the most common thing that drummers do add in extra is extra kicks. So you can have like gum gum ka, gum ka, that kind of shit. Like, it's the most common thing to do. There's a way of doing it with snares other than just hitting the snare the same volume. It's called a ghost note. I mean, replicating in MIDI is not the easiest thing to do, so maybe avoid trying to replicate ghost notes, but if you know what they are and you can do it in MIDI, that's an extra way of doing it. Here's just some stuff with some extra kicks and some extra snares. Sounds pretty good. And then it's got the fancy fill at the end too. Okay, so that is kind of working around the same style of beat. It's constantly doing the kick on 1 and 3 and the snare on 2 and 4. Even if it's got the extra stuff, it's still the same kind of beat. But you don't have to do that. There's other styles of beats. Like this one, where you just do snare on 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you do kick on the and, so it's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. It sounds faster, it sounds a lot more energetic. You can do a cymbal on just the snare when you just do the snare, or you can do it on both and it sounds even kind of bigger and washier, depending on the cymbal that you play. Here's how that sounds. So obviously this gives off a completely different vibe. You will probably know if you're a guitarist or a bassist what kind of beat you want over what it is that you've written. Maybe this is the style of thing that you were thinking of. Okay, for all of my metal fans out there, how do you translate any of that into like a metal song? Because none of that sounds like it would ever work. And you're right, a lot of the time metal uses a thing called halftime. It's a way of making something sound huge. In faster sections, they don't use it, but in those big kind of huge metal sections, or if you like something like gent that's doing a lot of kick patterns, halftime's probably what they're doing. So what's actually happening is the kick is happening on 1 and only 1, and the snare is happening on 3 and only 3. You could have it again and just do kick at the beginning of the first bar, snare at the beginning of the second bar, and then it's like half time. I'll leave that up to you with what kind of tempo you're doing. If it's a quicker tempo, you might be able to get away with that slower version. If you're in a slower tempo, the normal halftime is probably going to be enough for you. But with metal, what tends to happen, because a lot of the drummers have double kick pedals, so both of their feet can be used to the same kick drum, they can play a lot more kicks than a normal drummer can with a single pedal. So they will play a lot of kicks. Something like this. Okay, last, and I'm going to add a lot more complicated stuff in here, we're going to talk about different velocities. So far I've only shown you the different things you can hit, but you actually have 127 different degrees of volume, velocity, that you can give a sample. Samples obviously being the noise that you're hearing from the software. Some softwares have it so that like from 0 to 30, it plays one sample and it's actually them hitting it a bit quiet. From 31 to 80, it's a kind of medium range sample where they've actually hit the drum kind of well but not too hard, and then from 81 to 127 it's a really loud sample, and then the volume degrees are changed for each of those in respect to the numbers that you would put in for the velocity. What that means is that you can make the drums sound like they're being played by a real person, because a real person will never hit the kick and the snare at the same impact every single time. Sometimes they don't even want to. That's where ghost notes come in, where you are actually playing the snare a lot quieter for those ghost notes. So you can do that inside of MIDI. It varies on where it is on the program, but generally if you write a thing, you can click on it and then change the velocity per thing. Logic has this really cool feature called Humanize. So if you write a load of stuff and it's all the same velocity, you can highlight it all, go to Humanize, and then it will kind of vary them a little bit. You can set the threshold so you can have it vary a lot, you can have it not very much. You can also draw lines on graphs to have it go from quiet to loud. You can kind of go wild with this. A big thing that a lot of people hate about MIDI drums is that they sound like MIDI drums. Doing this and changing the velocities is the way around that. That's how you make it feel human. So with that, I've got a bit more of a jazz beat. It's in 6/8, but it's got a lot of variations to it. It's got a lot of velocity changes in it, and it's kind of a decent example of what you can actually achieve using different velocities. It's also got a fill. So that's everything that you should need to know about writing drums in MIDI. You can make it sound as human as you want. You can add extra things. Just remember that what you're writing should be able to be played by a real drummer. So they only have 2 hands and 2 feet. So try not to write something that needs 7 limbs to be performed, unless you're doing that on purpose. So like an electronic style drum kit that's obviously like using a drum machine or whatever, you can get away with it. If you're using a natural sounding kit, but you're specifically doing something that is a bit out there and doesn't need to sound like a real drummer, fine, go with it. But if you want it to emulate real drummers, you gotta write it like it's a real drummer playing it. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you did like it, feel free to hit like. If you want to see more videos like this, we're trying to empower DIY artists on YouTube. Hit subscribe if you want. If you want to deep dive into a bit more about us, banddiy.com. We're on all the social medias if you want to give us a follow. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have a great day. We'll see you next week.